Begin, this video will contain major spoilers for Omori. If you haven't played it yet, you definitely should. However, I would also recommend looking up the trigger warnings first, because it is a psychological horror and goes into some pretty dark subjects, such as suicide. So, due to the nature of this game, that will have to be brought up a little bit in this video, so if you're not comfortable with that or don't want spoilers, feel free to skip this one. In this video, I will cover why Basil is such a controversial character in the fandom, different interpretations of the character, do some analysis on why he's more complex of a character than a lot of people give him credit for, and talk about my thoughts on the character. Before we begin, this is your reminder that we will be discussing a fictional video game character, so let's be respectful in the comments, okay? So Basil. I feel like the guy was set up for a subject of debate in the fandom just from his name. People can't even decide if it's pronounced Basil or Basil. It's obviously Basil. Anyway, the fandom seems to be as split as possible on as it possibly can be on Basil's character. We have one half of the fandom going, "Oh, I love Basil so much, he's so precious, I love the flower crowns and the photos, and Basil did nothing wrong, okay?" And the other half of the fandom going, "Oh, I hate Basil so much, he is the scum of the earth, he is the true villain of Omori. Every playthrough I always make sure to get the neutral ending so he can die horribly." So, what is the reason for this very strange split in the fandom, and should the fandom like Basil? The answer to this comes down to the interpretation of the game. Obviously, with most characters in media, every person is different and will therefore have different interpretations of the characters. However, with Basil, this is amplified. This is likely due to the fact that Basil had quite a limited screen time in the game, as in, he's the only member of the friend group besides Mari who doesn't join the party. Also, the player doesn't get much time to get attached to his headspace self before he disappears. And, in the real world, he's very anxious around Sunny and acts very awkward around him. The player is forced to string bits and pieces of information together in order to figure out Basil's motivations and morals, and people tend to weave together very different views of the character. So, a lot of Basil's actions and motivations are a bit of a mystery to the player until, of course, the big twist. Sunny accidentally pushed Mari down the stairs, killing her, and Basil tried to help his friend and cover up the accidental murder by using a jump rope to hang Mari and framing her death as a suicide. Hooray! Now, this is where a lot of people got really mad at Basil, or just felt more justified in hating Basil, if they already thought the character was whiny or annoying or just didn't like him before. If you don't like it for those reasons, that's just how the character made you feel during the game, and I'm not going to talk about that right now. However, I will say, though, that Basil was the only person throughout the game, until the very end, who knew what happened to Mari, and carried that guilt around him for the entire time. Most people probably wouldn't act the most stable if they had to do that. The people who hate Basil because of the truth sequence often wonder why the heck he would decide that was the best cover-up. There were so many other options. He could have just not gotten involved, or left the body at the bottom of the stairs, or literally anything that wasn't hanging her, because that was super messed up. And these people aren't wrong. Hanging the body was a terrible idea that had so many consequences on the friend group. However, at the time Basil was a child, he saw his friend commit murder, not only his friend, but his best friend, who he was very attached to. From Basil's dialogue during the fight scene, we see that he's convinced himself that Sunny didn't kill Mari. It was something behind him. So, in his head, he was just making sure that Sunny didn't get blamed. And think about it, if Mari had killed herself, then no one would ever suspect Sunny, Basil's best friend, and Basil, being a child, probably just thought that it was the perfect cause of death to cover up what really happened, without knowing how the death being framed as a suicide would completely change the way that everyone would cope with it. It made Hero feel as if he'd missed all the warning signs, and everyone wondered why they weren't there for Mari enough. She had her whole life ahead of her, and her friends and family would have to live with the idea that she was depressed and they had no idea and didn't get her the help she needed. Obviously, this made the already messed up situation way worse. But, since Basil was a child and in a state of panic, he wasn't really thinking clearly, and he didn't realize that this way of dying would be different from it being an accident, or an accidental murder, or whatever he framed it as. And probably shouldn't have framed it as anything, actually. All he knew was that it would help Sunny stay out of trouble. He didn't know how the legal system worked. He was a kid, and there was no way he wanted his friend to go to jail for something that Basil had convinced himself wasn't Sunny's fault. A common argument that people make against Basil is, why didn't he just tell his friends when he got older and started to realize that maybe it would be better just have his friends know about the accidental murder. However, Basil had already dug himself too deep at that point. If he told people, then he would put his friend Sunny back in danger. Oh, and let's just get this out of the way now. The argument of why did he know how to tie a noose really fails, because he makes flower crowns. He probably learned a lot about tying different types of knots from that. Besides, what is the point of that argument? What are you trying to get at here? Like, oh no, that's kind of creepy, don't you think? What do you think he's doing? Just traveling all over the world, covering up all kinds of murders with his epic noose tying skills? Like, that'd be a fun AU, but that argument makes no sense. At the most, it could have been just like a slight oversight in the game development. However, I think it's most likely this is just something as easily explained as he makes flower crowns. Also, the people who think that he's actually just took pictures of Mori's death are just wrong. Those pictures were in Sunny's dreams. They were a creative way to show the truth sequence since the player is used to putting photos in the album at that point. However, it isn't implied that he took those pictures in real life, as that would make no sense since he was trying to cover up the murder. That would also just be weird. This is just a misunderstanding of a stylistic element. If those photos were real, we probably also would have been shown them in the real world segments. Anyone who thinks he's completely perfect and did nothing wrong also really isn't helping, because obviously his actions had extremely negative consequences and were a terrible idea. However, what he did doesn't make him a bad person. Basil seems like a case of a good person being forced into a difficult situation where he chooses to do something horrible. Now let's talk about another point of controversy surrounding Basil that, depending on the player's interpretation of the character, may lead to people to draw different conclusions. Especially since Basil's dialogue during the scene is quite odd, and he's clearly not in a good state of mind while the scene is taking place. I'm of course talking about the Basil versus Sunny fight scene, in which all the people who love Basil frantically look for any way that they could possibly get around having to attack Basil, while the people who hate Basil gleefully spam the attack button. Now, what is going on in the scene? I think we have to take a look at some of Basil's dialogue here to understand why he has decided that fighting Sunny is a good idea. Don't worry, he says, "Don't worry, Sunny, I'll save you again. Something behind you. I'll get rid of it once and for all. Sunny, don't be scared. I'm scared too, but this is for the best. Everything is going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay." Notice that the talk about how he's going to save Sunny. This brings up another point that a lot of people who dislike Basil bring up. That a lot of his dialogue comes off to them as if he's manipulating Sunny to stay with him, or he's trying to pressure Sunny into trusting him more or being friends with him somehow. However, I don't think that's what Basil was trying to do. The dialogue reads as more desperate to me. Like he's like rambling, and he's genuinely trying to do what he thinks is best for Sunny, but he's so lost at this point that him trying to help Sunny is really more destructive than anything. But it doesn't seem as though he's trying to be manipulative. In this scene, he talks about the something, which, again, how delusional Basil seems here is up to the player's interpretation of the lore of the game. If the player has come to the conclusion that the something is a hallucination that Sunny and Basil have, then Basil seems like he's completely lost it. But if the player believes that the game has a supernatural element to it and something is really there, and only Sunny and Basil can see it because of their shared trauma, then Basil doesn't seem as bad here. Either way, we know from the neutral ending exactly what Basil would have done had Sunny not come in. So he clearly wasn't thinking straight here, and like the rest of the characters, needs therapy, honestly. During the game, Sunny has been on the upward climb and started to reconnect with a lot of his friends and heal a bit. However, Basil has been on the downward spiral. His mental state has been deteriorating rapidly. Of course, that's not an excuse for stabbing out Sunny's eye, but it's an explanation. And from the secret ending, where the something fades away after the truth is told, we can infer that it means that Basil wants to make up for everything and keep going. Also, Sunny looks awesome with an eye patch. Now for another point. Basil's infatuation with Sunny. Some people think that it's cute, some people think it's creepy, some people think he might have a crush. Either way, it's very clear that Basil is closer to Sunny than anyone in the friend group. He says a lot about Sunny in the photo album. One such quote is, "Sunny is younger than all of us. He's the baby of the group, so we have to take care of him." This is one of the things written under Sunny's birthday photo, so it was clearly meant as foreshadowing for Basil protecting Sunny by hanging Omori, trying to kill the something. It is also one of the many quotes that shows how much Basil cares about Sunny, maybe a bit more than normal. I will take that as a chance to talk about how amazing of a job the game does at portraying the home lives of each character and how they add to what we already know about them. They do this perfectly with all the characters, but this is a Basil video, so we're going to be talking about Basil here, and how this is tied to how much he cares about Sunny. When walking around Basil's house, the player can interact with his caretaker, Polly. She says a lot of really interesting things that give us more insight into Basil's home life and add depth to why he's so attached to Sunny, other than just being best friends. One thing that Polly says is, Basil's lived with his grandma since he was a toddler. His parents always seem to be too busy. I've only ever seen them once. This shows how Basil didn't really have a relationship with his parents since they left him in the care of his grandma and they rarely visit. As great as his grandma seems to be, she's getting older and weaker and can't do some of the same things she used to be. By the time we see her in the game, she's stuck in bed, and she's heavily implied to have died at the end of the game. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure she was a great parent to Basil. However, there was probably a part of him that wanted someone else to confide in. So, who could that be? Sunny. Basil and Sunny are the most shy and reserved people in the friend group, so Basil instantly gravitated toward him. This is shown by the fact that in the photo album, when Basil's often next to Sunny in the photos, or he writes about how he spends so much time with Sunny. However, then Sunny shuts himself up in his room, and his friend group falls apart. Who does he turn to then? Not Polly, since she says, "I've been taking care of Basil for 2 years already, but I barely know anything about him. I wish he would open up about himself more. I just want to help." Since Basil didn't really have any friends outside of his now broken friend group, and with Aubrey making a lot of people see him as a creep and bullying him, Basil had no one to turn to, and didn't feel comfortable being open with his new caretaker either. So, is it any surprise how strange he acts when Sunny shows up again after years of not leaving his house, only to say that he will be leaving again in 3 days? He finally has the person that he can talk to back in his life after all this time, but he's leaving again. And can they even be normal around each other after what they did to Mari? Now, another interesting point about Basil is, did Sunny forgive him for what he did? Some people argue that because of the very morbid times that Basil died a lot in Black Space, some people interpreted this as Sunny being happy to watch Basil die over and over again because he's still mad at him for hanging Mari. However, others argue that it was simply a defense mechanism to cover up the truth. Sometimes, before Basil is killed, he brings up something about how he needs to tell Omori something. This can be read instead of Omori taking pleasure in watching Headspace Basil die, he's doing it to protect Sunny from the truth. Basil is the only one who knows the truth, besides maybe Sunny, but Sunny's repressing it so much that he doesn't really know it. So Omori causing Basil to die is symbolic for him trying to get rid of the truth, rather than the hatred of Basil. In the raft area in Black Space, shortly before his head falls off, Basil says, "Actually, there's something that's been really bothering me. Would you care to hear me out?" This is most likely referring to the truth, yet Omori silences him yet again. This is further evidence for Basil being killed to erase the truth rather than as revenge. Although, some people may interpret it as a little bit of both. However, in the secret ending when Sunny and Basil smile at each other as their something fades away, it seems to be implied that the truth coming out into the open allows for them to forgive each other and themselves and start to move forward. Also, just a quick note, it doesn't really make sense when some people say that Sunny deserves forgiveness but Basil doesn't. Sunny is the one who killed Mari. Personally, I think they should both be forgiven eventually, after the group has had a lot of time to process everything. The reason that some people tend to forgive Sunny but not Basil is likely because you play as Sunny the whole game. You have a level of understanding with him that you just don't have with Basil, since you've literally been inside Sunny's subconscious. However, not knowing as much about Basil is part of the fun of interpreting his character. With what can be seen of Basil and his guilt and motivations, as I have been explaining throughout this essay, he deserves to be forgiven alongside Sunny eventually after the friends have had a lot of time to process everything. If you're someone who doesn't believe that either of them deserve forgiveness, then that's really about your worldview of where the line of forgiveness is drawn, and this video is not about to delve into that. So, and also another thing that people can't agree on about Basil is whether or not he was actually in Sunny's dreams, or if the dream Basils are just Sunny's subconscious recreating Basil in his dreams. The white egret orchard, which symbolizes the phrase, "My thoughts will follow you into your dreams," appears many times throughout the game. This leads some people to believe that Basil is actually sharing dreams with Sunny, and therefore all the creepy truth stuff that Stranger Basil says and all the times that Basil dies is actually Basil. However, others like myself tend to interpret this more figuratively, as in what the characters, including Basil, do outside of Sunny's dreams causes him to internalize ideas about them, which are shown throughout how he imagines them to act in the dream world, rather than their thoughts literally following him into his dreams. If people believe that Basil is really in the dream world, then that would give me even more to analyze. However, I personally do not fully believe this theory, and this video is long enough as it is, so I'm just using it as another example of another thing that changes about Basil depending on your theories and interpretations of the game. Okay, so sorry for that incredibly long ramble. I just really love Omori. In conclusion, Basil's character is quite controversial in the fandom due to how up to interpretation a lot of his dialogue and actions are, and how little of him we see compared to the rest of the characters in the friend group. However, his character is very interesting, and sometimes the complexities of the writing of his character are overlooked by the people in the fandom. Personally, I believe that Basil is a genuinely good person who was put into some really terrible situations, and under the pressure and panic, he made a lot of really bad decisions. I'll admit he's my favorite Omori character, so maybe I'm a little biased. To clarify, I'm in no way claiming that he made the correct choices. He obviously made terrible mistakes, and this essay was really just to talk more about why Basil, despite his mistakes, isn't a terrible person, and sometimes the fandom tends to view him in a black and white lens with little room for nuance, and doesn't really consider how complex and interesting of a character he is and write him off as a monster. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have a different interpretation of Basil's character, or just want to leave your thoughts in the comments below, please feel free to do so. However, let's please remember that Basil's a fictional character, and I'm rambling about the morality and interpretations of a fictional character. So let's all have respectful discussions in the comments about how awesome a video game character, and okay, bye! After the speed paint finishes.